This episode is sponsored by Manta Sleep. Manta Sleep makes sleep masks and sleep accessories that help you get the energy to create your best life. Head to the link in our description to get 10% off. Places where I expect to find salamanders: ponds, puddles, bogs, seasonal wetlands, maybe under a nice moist rock or a rotting log, perhaps in a cave if I'm looking for a real weirdo. Mostly, of course, I'm thinking about places that are low to the ground and wet. What I am not thinking about is a salamander launching itself at me from the canopy of the tallest forests in the world. But it turns out, today's guys can spend their entire life cycle hundreds of feet above the ground. And as a result, they're pretty well suited to climbing and skydiving. The Bizarre Beasts Pin Club is open for subscriptions for the whole month. Sign up by August 20th and your first pin will be a wandering salamander. The wandering salamander, Aneades vagrans, has all of the essential salamander vibes that you might expect. It has colors and patterns suitable for camouflaging itself in a forest environment. It needs to stay consistently wet, and it looks, pretty salamandery. The staying wet thing is because the species has no lungs and instead has to breathe through its skin, which moisture makes possible. But even being lungless, which seems pretty weird to me, is actually par for the salamander course. The family that A. vagrans belongs to is full of species with this trait, and it is a family that makes up about 2/3 of all known salamanders. This beast is about 13 centimeters long and eats various bugs and stuff, again in classic salamander fashion. And it was thought to live from northwestern California up through coastal Oregon and Washington and into southwestern British Columbia, but this is where the strangeness begins, because what was once considered to be a continuous population spanning that range was later genetically determined to be two different species: the clouded salamander and the, at that time new to science, wandering salamander, the star of today's episode. This created an odd problem. The newly described species was found abundantly in Northern California and southern British Columbia, but nowhere in between. This phenomenon earned the salamander the wandering part of its name, and may have been initially caused at least in part by human activity in the 1800s. The two separate populations of wandering salamanders, along with the clouded salamander cousins that they bookend, all live where they do for good reasons: big forests, full of trees. Which brings us to the climbing. Turns out, scaling trees and other plants isn't actually that rare for salamanders, it's just that almost all examples come from the tropics. The only known temperate species with such a climbing knack are the 10 that make up the Aneades genus. And the common name for this whole group, appropriately enough, is the climbing salamanders. But they don't have claws or suction cups or the other hallmark climbing adaptations you might find in other amphibians or even reptiles. Instead, they mostly just make do with longer limbs and a prehensile tail, plus sliming themselves up against surfaces to help prevent falling as well. And another shared trait among the climbing salamanders is that they don't go through metamorphosis. They hatch from their eggs as tiny versions of what they will look like as adults. Females lay about a dozen eggs in late spring or early summer, hiding them inside of logs or under tree bark, where she will then guard them until they hatch. Wandering salamander eggs have been found under bark 30 to 40 meters above the ground. So without an aquatic larval phase, there's not much need for them to actually ever come down. Also, just have to say, shout out to the scientists who did that research. And this is what really sets the species apart from other temperate climbing salamanders: the possibility that they may be able to stay up in their trees permanently. And because of where they live, the trees in question are huge. These guys have been observed at 91 meters up, and redwoods can grow quite a bit taller. But without obvious climbing gear like more specialized arboreal species, how does the wandering salamander still manage to successfully navigate its home in the sky? And also, how did it get up there to begin with? Well, one key skill for an animal spending any amount of time that high up, if it's not flying anyway, is the ability to just hold on. And the climbing salamander genus has always been a source of interest here, thanks to their square-shaped toes that contain lots and lots of blood vessels. Scientists had several ideas about what those could be used for, with the most likely explanation being that controlling blood flow to the tips of their toes could allow these salamanders to strategically alter their grip. And sure enough, a 2025 study made the wandering salamander the first species to give a living demonstration of exactly that. Less blood flow makes the flexible toe tissue more concave for gripping, while higher flow makes it more convex for letting go, and the switch from one to the other correlates pretty predictably as the salamander moves. And this actually isn't far off from the mechanism used by tree frog toes and even hyrax feet. And wandering salamanders are not the only member of their genus to have this vascular feature. They're just the first ones where we've actually seen it in action. And action is very much the name of the game with this next trait, because walking up and down an entire redwood is slow going for such a little guy. So at least for the down part, to speed up the process, the wandering salamander just jumps. Often, this escape method is in response to a threat. But unlike a Bizarre Beasts classic, the pumpkin toadlet, wandering salamanders have excellent aerodynamic control of their bodies, allowing them to fall with style, thanks in part to their lankiness. Using their tail and legs, they can carefully tweak their trajectory, allowing them to control their descent and get where they want to go. In a wind tunnel experiment, they were even observed to maneuver themselves right side up when dropped upside down. Other Eniades species in the experiment showed similar abilities, but the wandering salamander performed the best, and by contrast, the one non-arboreal salamander species tested had far and away the toughest time. So sure, these guys have shown that they can handle the high life, but this still doesn't answer a very important question. What are they even doing up there in the first place? Well, there are plenty of good reasons to climb a tree in a tropical rainforest. More places to nest and hide, more things to eat, and plenty of moisture year-round. So for a salamander moving into a new niche, this isn't actually that strange of a choice. Temperate forests, on the other hand, may carry risks like freezing temperatures or low humidity depending on the season. But the prospect of more and better prey items, avoidance of predators, or even the means to more easily smell important smells all may be enough to entice a salamander to at least take up the tree life for part of the year. Still, that doesn't really get at why wandering salamanders might specifically take up residence in the tallest trees to ever live. But those trees happen to grow in an area that never really gets below freezing and maintains significant precipitation all year long. Redwood bark can grow up to 35 centimeters thick and is basically made of nooks and crannies just begging for salamander eggs. And on top of that, redwoods are so enormous that they actually create whole habitats on themselves. Their branches have enough surface area for organic material to accumulate, break down into multiple layers of soil, and then support entire communities of other plants, including giant clusters of ferns that continually store water. And at least some research suggests that these fern mats may house more than enough tasty invertebrates to be worth the wandering salamander's while. So those are some possible explanations of the why, but the evolutionary question of how is a bit more complicated. Because weirdly enough, of all the salamanders in the world that can climb, the traits that help them do so aren't very consistent. For example, long limbs and a wide toe spread act as specializations for tree salamanders just as effectively as they do for cave and cliff species. But the prevailing wisdom for a while was actually that stubbier feet with webbing were instead the more ideal arboreal setup. In fact, living in trees seems to have independently evolved at least 5 times in this one salamander family. And even though there are characteristics that clearly benefit arboreal species, those salamanders aren't physically all that different from the ones that exclusively live on the ground. Not only that, but salamanders seem to be evolving from the ground into the trees and then back again with no obvious rhyme or reason. It may just be that salamanders have sometimes convergently evolved similar traits for climbing and have sometimes convergently evolved climbing behavior itself, but via totally different traits. Or it may be as simple as the fact that salamanders in general have just enough of what it takes to stumble into arboreal life on a whim, and sometimes this has stuck long enough for a little bit of selection to follow. So while a special blood grip and uncanny base jumping skills both undoubtedly give the wandering salamander a competitive edge for its high-altitude lifestyle, its ancestors' skyward drive may have had no more of a complicated evolutionary basis than why not? Kind of like the venomous frogs that we covered previously, the wandering salamander is a case where the peculiarities of the beast in question are bizarre less because of their rarity and more because of their newness to us. After all, this isn't the only treetop salamander out there, so there's plenty of reason to believe that more species might have similar quirks. But that doesn't make it any less surprising for a tiny creature you'd expect to find hiding on the forest floor to instead go cruising around the canopy of the world's tallest trees. Sign up for the Pin Club at BizarreBeastShow.com and help us keep this channel going. If you want a salamander to be your first pin, sign up by August 20th.
Thank you for watching Bizarre Beasts. You help our nonprofit Complexly bring more educational videos to more people every time you watch, comment, share, and tell people about a Bizarre Beast video and the Pin Club. And speaking of pins, we're having a sale. Right now at BizarreBeastShow.com, all of our past pins are buy 3, get 1 free. That means you could stock up on reptiles and get an eyelash viper, and a sea snake, and a giant tortoise, and then get a Mexican mole lizard for free. Or maybe you want some mammals, and you get an orca, and a greater bulldog bat, and a hyrax, and then that Sacoglossum sea slug is just so cute, so you get it too for free. These a la carte pins are all left over from the Pin Club, so we will not be reordering them if they run out. And they may run out. I hear we only have 7 of these Yeti crab pins left. Show your support for the show and Bizarre Beasts everywhere, and pick up some pins right now at BizarreBeastShow.com.
And now for some bonus facts. Scientists are not in full agreement about how exactly this salamander wandered from Northern California up to Vancouver without ever going through Oregon or Washington, but it may have something to do with 19th century leather production, or glaciers, or a series of raft trips. Normally, when there's a big divide between populations, it can be attributed to an obvious geographic separator, past or present. For example, if a gargantuan river of ice plowed through a previously intact habitat, this would pretty effectively split things up. The glacial hypothesis of the wandering salamander's distribution maintains that the northern and southern populations of the species represent glacial refugia, areas untouched by glaciers and thus free to act as biodiversity oases. And sure enough, lichen and plant evidence support the idea that these two regions were in fact glacial refugia, but the two salamander populations are too closely related to have been separated since that long ago. Possibly the most popular explanation is that loose logs from Northern California got randomly carried up to Vancouver by the natural oceanic currents of the area. But this would rely on a lot of dead trees falling into the ocean and a lot of salamanders surviving that experience. Still, not totally out of the question. Which brings us to the leather hypothesis. In the late 1800s, several tanneries were being built in the Vancouver area, each of which required a whole bunch of bark from tan oak, a tree that produces a lot of the tannins required to make leather. And when this tan oak bark was shipped from California northward, it may have contained a bunch of salamanders. Because the wandering salamander doesn't live exclusively on redwoods, those are just the most dramatic of their tree choices. Salamanders shipped in the oak bark would have then made a break for it and thrived in their new Canadian home, all without the trouble of ever setting foot in Oregon or Washington. Now, it's impossible to say for sure whether this was the actual cause of this salamander's journey. But as we learned with the Brahminy blind snake, humans do have a knack for shuttling bizarre beasts far and wide. When you want to start a nap, but you can't just slide into a dark and cozy redwood nook like a salamander would, you need to build an ideal nook around your face instead. And that's where today's sponsor, Manta Sleep, comes in. They make the world's best sleep masks and functional sleep accessories, and they're fueled by their mission to enable better lives through better sleep and regular naps. Take their Manta Pro Sleep Mask, for example. It's built with advanced materials science for unmatched breathability and ventilation, infinite adjustability, and a premium feel. Salamanders might be able to fall from trees with style, but with this Manta Pro Sleep Mask, I fall asleep with style. It's like a cave in here. Great sleep is the non-negotiable foundation you need to create your best life. So check out Manta Sleep and make sure to use code BizarreBeasts for 10% off your order. And then take a nap.